through and have a seat. Grab a seat. We're going to kick it off in a sec. You guys are very obedient. Welcome to Frost 64. We're back. It is so cool to see all of you guys here physically. I mean, we've been doing so many Zoom calls, you know the story. It's so nice to be seeing you guys all again in the flesh. And we've been doing this for a very long time. I think it's like 5 or more. Like since we began, we've been doing deFrost. And it's been very much part of our culture and about inspiring ideas, inspiring people, coming together, discussions, debate. And as I said, I'm really excited to have you here. I want to today obviously acknowledge the Gadigal people of the traditional owners of the land that we gathered today and our studio is based on, and extend the respect to all First Nation peoples, including elders past and present and emerging. And this is a really important place. I want to thank all of you again for coming. I want to thank my team for putting this event on. I am going to read a few things. So this is now going to be quarterly. So before COVID, we were doing it monthly, which is really cool, a lot of work, but we decided to make it more sustainable. We're going to do it quarterly. So look out for that. And it's going to be really, really cool. I met Dave a while back. I don't know how long ago it was, when he had this crazy idea of creating Jaunt, which is a beautiful name. Dave kind of pivoted in 2018. He was a creative director for Isobar. And it's quite incredible to shift and do what you're doing today. We're just talking about it. It's only been 4 years, but what significant change. I love Defenders. In England, I had an old Land Rover 1971. I think it was Series 2 or whatever it was. Had no roof, and I was driving around London through winter time with snow and rain, and I just loved the car. I just loved the fact that it was so robust and durable. So he started Jaunt, what is it, like 3 years ago, 2 years ago?
3 years ago,
And we're very lucky to have Dave here today. We've been really excited. We've been we didn't name or create the brand Jaunt. I wish we had, because as I said at the time, I love it. But we helped him recently, and Chris in Bristol, his new partner, with helping them create Fellten. And so our team has worked really closely with them in that. And you'll talk more about that today. It's obviously an exciting time for EVs, electric vehicles. It's something that is on a massive curve, and it's really exciting to see. We've got a Mini out here, Tones Mini there. We'll talk about that probably later, but that's really cool. It's electric conversion too. It's really exciting. I think Dave told me that something like 40 million classic cars in the world that potentially need to be converted to electric. So again, we'll talk about that later, which is incredible. But obviously this is, we feel like Australia is quite a way behind in terms of electric vehicles and the infrastructure that goes with that, but it's changing on a daily basis. There's news every day, every week, and that's kind of creating really great momentum. And it's really encouraging to see that change. We're all about designing a better world, and we're a B Corp organization as well. So we really want to do the right thing by being sustainable and making the right decisions in what we do as an organization. I want to thank OzHarvest. OzHarvest is a van outside there, which we branded. Friends, they're just down the road, across the road, so we worked a lot with them. An amazing organization, and we're really proud to be supporting them tonight, and you guys feeding us tonight as well. And we partnered with you guys for like 10 years, which is really, really cool. Thanks for the drinks from Australian Wines. You guys enjoying that? And our new friends, Yuli's, amazing brewery around the corner for the Australian beers. Heaps Normal, another friends of ours, non-alcoholic beers, which are amazing. I drink a lot of that. And thanks for Samuel, who our videographer here, who's a B Corp himself. So well done on that, mate. And our waiter from Stedman Hospitality. Also did a little thing, got a candle which we just designed with Craig from Raconteur. Craig's there in the white pants. He's the most stylish guy here. Well, we really met Craig, and we're really loved what Craig is doing, because he creates an incredible sense for organizations And we see that as part of branding is a really important part of utilizing and engaging all of our senses. And so we created a candle together called Chapters, which is for sale. We'll give you a discount, 10% if you want it. This is not meant to be a plug. I said to Luca, let's not plug it, but I just did. Ideal Christmas present. It's there if you want it. If not, you can buy it online. frostshop.au. Natalie Smith is our head of brand. Really proud to have Natalie as part of our team. And she's had incredible experience around the world. And we're lucky to have her with us. And she joined about 3 months ago, or is it more than that?
It's more than that, but
Is it? She's smiling, or that, I don't know. Maybe she had you have a few drinks, or no?
Just
you're fine.
one.
But it's really cool because one of the first projects that Nat and the team worked on when Nat joined us, it was already underway was the work we were doing with Dave and Chris in Bristol around creating Fellten. It didn't have a name, Fellten, at the time. That was the part of the gig. But it's really, really cool. And our team, Richard, they're our creative director and brand, and David here, and Beck, Georgie, somewhere over there. And who else worked on it? There's a whole bunch of other people. Is that it?
that's about it.
Gab.
Gab, yeah.
We were really excited to work with this idea. Like Dave said, we're gonna join forces with this company in Bristol. It's like, wow, that's crazy. I would have been satisfied with John, but big, expansive idea and really ambitious. And I think that possibly, as you were a creative director, you're thinking big like that too, in terms of thinking differently about the potential of this idea and the potential of the brand. And what we're going to do today is Nat's going to grill him.
I'm going to grill him.
And we're going to hear a lot about David's journey, the ambition for Fellten, the work that we've done together, and the story behind that. And obviously, there's a lot of people in the audience who are creative people, strategists, people in the automobile industry and electrification of automobiles as well, which is really, really exciting. And Dion over there, my kettlebell training guru, and other people in the audience as well. But without further ado, we're going to hand over to Nat.
Thank you, Vince. Hi, everybody. I feel like Vince has told you most of what we're going to talk about tonight, but I think we're really excited to share the work that we've done for Fellten. I think, it's really beautiful, and will be flashing up behind us, so you can kind of get an idea of the journey we've been on from a brand perspective as we speak. And we'll talk about a few of the ideas that have kind of come to life on it. But I want to start by asking Dave, how did we get here?
How far back do I go?
I guess, you've embarked on this merger. You've merged Zero EV and Jaunt. And I think for some of the people in the audience, it'd be great to talk a little bit about what those two businesses were separately, and then what the merged entity is looking to achieve.
That's a good start point. Okay. So Jaunt, as Vince mentioned, was a business that I started with a friend of mine, Martine. She was also from advertising and video production. We'd always worked together in a complementary disagreement kind of fashion, in a way that a creative director and a producer account manager will work well together. So same goals, but competing priorities, perhaps. And somewhere in the middle, we got shit done. And we'd worked together on and off for 12, 15 years. And I left my old gig, was figuring out what I wanted to do, kind of had this seed of an idea. She was unhappy in her job, approached me about a really smart business idea that would have built on all our expertise and experience, would have been really smart. And I came in and said, yeah, that's good, but what about this crazy thing? And managed to, I guess, using my creative director pitching skills, convince her that this was the right path. But we both had an interest in this field, and that field was really four-wheel driving, and that's, I guess, not an uncommon thing in Australia. But I had got to this point, having owned a four-wheel drive, like a classic Land Rover, which maybe there's photos of there and there's parts of one. It doesn't really matter. If you imagine an old four-wheel drive, you're imagining the right thing. And that experience of using that and travelling around Australia, but also coming to a kind of a realisation that me burning 300 litres of diesel to get to the Flinders Ranges, to breathe the beautiful clean air and see the pristine environment was somewhat hypocritical. But what was I going to do about it? Like, what other option did I have? I wanted an electric four-wheel drive. There's none on the market. There's still none on the market. So I wanted a product, and having worked within the car industry and stuff for a little bit, knew the car sales figures, right? Australians buy more four-wheel drives than anyone in the world per capita. And you look at the car sales statistics, and you're not perhaps as aware of it inner city Melbourne, Sydney, but as soon as you get out, it's dual cab utes everywhere. And that is way more than the rest of the world, even the United States, where it's like a couple of big trucks, and then it's Camrys and Corollas and normal, sedans all the way down. So Australians buy those kinds of cars, and particularly 3 or 4 years ago, the EVs that you could buy were not those cars, and they still aren't. So I guess I perhaps wanted to do, I really wanted this product, but I could also see a potential societal demand. So you put those two things together and you're like, well, that could potentially be a business. And, a lot of other things go into doing that. But we kind of thought that this idea of going, we're not going to change the world, we're not going to change Australia into an EV powerhouse by building a few, electric four-wheel drives in volume. But maybe we can get people inspired about it. And if we get someone to open up and go, oh, electric four-wheel drives will never work, but then you say, oh, well, just look at where the charging points actually are. And they look at the charger map. There's a great website called PlugShare that I encourage you to look up if you never have. Charging points everywhere, which is to also say that every power point is a charge point. But if we can do that and start to change minds and hearts through that, then we've kind of done a job, and we've got to build some cool product along the way. For me, that idea of building something cool was I knew that I needed to do that as a job, that I'd have jobs where I'd love the people, I'd love the product we were making, I'd love the process, but I hadn't necessarily loved the mission maybe of the company or the company that we were working for ultimately. And I knew I needed to do that because to stop me changing careers every 5 years or so, I needed something that kind of combined all those things. And I sort of saw in EV conversions a technology that was at a point where it worked, but it needed to be designed into something that wasn't just an engineering test or prototype, but something that was a real product. So that to make the conversion, and so the swap of that old Mini or an old Land Rover or whatever it might be, go from just spinning the wheels to feeling like this is a whole car. So from the fonts on the gauges to making those human readable so that you can get in. And I ended up having a picture of my mum up on our kind of, not mood board, but kind of like, what are we doing? How are we doing this? And I was like, I want to be able to hand the keys to my mum and her to be able to get in a car that we build and be able to drive it. And not just because we're forcing her to, but to also make it, because there's always that.
She's your mum.
But yeah, right. And she would do it just for me. But to make it approachable is really what we had. That we were trying to do a couple of things. That we were reducing the kind of mechanical complexity of the old cars, reducing the technological complexity. So getting away from that idea that every new car brand has its own operating system, has its own language, its own icons. Lovely work for the design team, but very, very confusing for the drivers. It takes you a lot of months to get to this point where you actually understand all the features. They work great selling cars because you can add features quite quickly, but it's not necessarily about, doesn't necessarily add to your day-to-day. So how do we create something that is truly approachable? And the other big thing was, how do we make the whole vehicle, we kind of condensed it down to the idea that it belonged. And I guess a lot of car brands will be like, oh, it's about the open road and it's about adventure and it's about this. And really, they're a commuting appliance and they do that really well, and that's okay. But when we're dealing with classics, we were like, imagine, you're in a small country town and you're there for the local food and the local wine and the experience and all these things. And the one thing out of place is probably your Toyota Yaris or something. Now, maybe we're overthinking this, but the idea that tapping into that nostalgia and that sense of place and belonging that an old four-wheel drive might have or a classic old sports car might have, that these things evoke something much more than a new car. Now we're also kind of standing on the shoulders of of some of the 20th century's best designs, but that's okay too, right? We can build on that and then bring a level of usability. And I think for me, I'd always, in hindsight, I realised that all my sort of design work had really been about user experience and usability first. Sometimes that needs to be beautiful, sometimes that needs to get out of the way, and being able to treat the approach to designing a car, now the shell's there, but how does it work, how does it feel, how does it interact with you, all of those little details was something that if we got right, we've taken the idea of conversions from something that is quite obscure, that most people in the world do not know can even happen, to something that is a product that people can consider maybe not as a primary car, but as a secondary car. But what we've discovered is people are actually buying, people who've never owned a classic, never owned an electric car, are buying cars from us that are their first or their only car.
Wow, that's
and
really
using, so it's sort of like, I was describing the other day, I don't know if it's a great analogy, but it's like we'd been locked out of 60s and 70s fashion forever because there was some kind of complexity to it. And now you can have any car that you want from a look point of view. And it works, and you don't have to be a mechanic.
See, I think that's so interesting because I think a lot of the brand thinking and the design process was about that merging of the old and the new. So all of the conventions of, I mean, you can see it in the work, that really like classic car and the beauty of it. And then thinking about, the electric conversions as the future and progressive. Maybe tell us a little bit about, I guess, the name Fellten. Where did that come from? I know where it came from, but I'm asking you a leading question.
And then from your slide deck.
Yeah, came from the wonderful, wonderful Richard. But I think also, when we were creating the brand, what were we like? What's the idea? What were we thinking about? What were the kind of aspects of it that were really important to bring to life?
So that was my really long first answer, but very quickly. So Zero EV, the other half. So to create Fellten, there's another company in the UK called Zero EV. Now we're collectively called Fellten as we merge, but they also produce systems for electrification of classic vehicles. So they are a few years older. The UK market's a few years more mature. So they're twice the size headcount-wise of us. They're 30 people versus our sort of 14. But collectively, we kind of cross over quite nicely, have a good complementary skill set. So anyway, we've merged and we're together and we're this. Just to give you that bit of context.
We're going global.
We're global.
Yeah.
So with that coming together, I'm sure there's someone who probably knows the stat, but I'm just going to make up that 63% of every mergers fail, right? I'm sure it's a really high number, and understandably so, because it's hard, right? And merger can often be, what is that code for acquisition? Is it a giant company swallowing another one? We were lucky that we were two small companies, still flexible enough to change our ways and not be stuck in processes or whatever, or names. And so we came together, and it was a bit of I guess we had our ulterior motive to coming and working with a brand agency was that the work and the process that you'd take us through is the process that we needed to go through as a business. But we would because we would just never find the time to be like, what's your real desire about this company? What do you really feel? Describe your company as a food, like all those weird things that you do. No, I know you guys did, right? But there's a design process that maybe is not that silly, but maybe a sense, right? That you do want to go through to get these desires out. And who you are and who your staff are, who your customers are, that is the most dreamy work that you can do in terms of trying to integrate companies and understand where everyone sits. So in that journey and approaching you guys, it allowed us to, by needing to create a new name and a new brand, and we did need to create a new name because jaunt is a great name. It means it's a 17th century word, means short journey for pleasure, which describes what you do in a classic car so well. Unfortunately, in the UK, it's used as a verb often. And it's used as a verb. So I have a little Google alert on the word jaunt, and I get occasionally it's us, and every day it's UK tabloids talking about someone having an affair and going on a jaunt to the continent. So for them, they're like, we understand that that's a good brand in Australia, North America, almost everywhere, but we cannot be called jaunt in the UK. which is okay. And I think it's nice that we actually collectively come up with a new name. So we were trying to, we're trying to describe how do we make technology fun? What are we doing this for? You probably might have seen it go through, but the word joy came up when you guys sort of talked through us and led us down this path, and we got to this idea that joy, that it is actually fun. We're doing this because what we're creating is then really like guilt-free enjoyment of cars. And although we're making the components that someone else then installs in a car in a workshop far away, ultimately what we're delivering is that. The other thing was, there's all those elements that go into creating a global brand, right? Is the trademark available? Is the website available? All of these kinds of things? Is a Googleable word that we can own? And does it sound nice? And have that, like you mentioned, that balance between old and new. How do you find something that fits that? What are we drawing on as a reference? Every car brand that you look out there, or traditional car brands, it's like someone's name or a suburb. And if you think about it, they all kind of fit into that category. They're really boring. They're names of companies created by engineers, and they've just gone, oh yeah, my name's Holden and it's called Holden. So my name's Ford and it's called Ford, or it's Bavarian Motorworks because we're in Bavaria, right? So can we be more than that? And can we add some aspirational element to all of this? And if we can create a brand that's strong enough that goes beyond, we are never going to be able to compete with Mini, Porsche, Land Rover. Those words, those models, we can't. Maybe we're around for 100 years. But if we can create something that people are happy to want to put the badge on the back of their car, and that it evokes, I guess, what we're trying to evoke, this idea of it feels familiar, but it's also new somehow. So then, we'd gone through a lot of names and we'd all had input and we'd all gone down different paths. We were really interested in perhaps picking up a word that was from that was Old English or Welsh, because Bristol's just on the border to Wales. That was perhaps so many brands are like, it's a Latin word and a Greek word mashed together or something like that, that has a deeper meaning. And then the team, these guys presented, had a few sort of finalists, and I don't know what you guys felt at the time, whether this was your favourite.
It was the favourite, right, Rich? It was definitely the favourite.
Yeah, and so then in a Zoom call with all of us from the UK and Australia, and then they ticked over to Fellten, which is Welsh for lightning. And so it both, at the same time we were like, we don't want an obvious pun in the name, right? We don't want an obvious nod to electricity, but you don't get that, right? You get a word that sounds familiar.
It has heft, doesn't
yeah,
it?
Yeah,
It sounds like
it's
sounds
nice,
like a brand.
2 syllables is nice, all of these little things. But that, I think for me, it was that, I've not heard it, but yet I think I have, which is that balance of old and new that we're really trying to create. So the lightning part's really cool, but it's actually a really nice word, and a word that no one else had ever used.
Which is very hard to come by.
Yeah.
Cool. And I guess from a... It's Vince, he's allowed to do that.
He forgot to jump in. Phones.
I do.
Turn your phones off, guys, please.
No interruptions. And then thinking about, obviously we always work to a brand idea, and we're not going to talk too much about the branding tonight, but I think it's quite interesting to talk about a lot of the aspects that build up the brand. There's a lot of reference to sort of older colour palettes. There's a lot of a reference to kind of conventions around automotive branding, the history of that kind of counterbalanced by modernity and the progression that electric cars evoke. So give you a very short runway to talk about the creativity and the sort of aesthetic of the brand and what we've kind of gone through together.
I think, well, we're still
We're
this
still-
journey.
we're
Final
still on the
handover
road.
this week.
Fresh out of the box.
Yeah, it's I think it's been a really interesting thing to describe, because on one hand it is a brand new brand, but it's also one that has to live with a collection of other brands, like I mentioned, Porsche or Mini or Land Rover or whatever it might be. So it's got to live in this world that crosses 50, 60 years of design as well. It's got to, we want it to stand out and be more than we are essentially a B2B company. That's who we sell complete systems and parts to. However, we have a B2C audience, and that customer is often driving the business who is our customer to come to us. I want that, but I want it electric. Can you build it and go and do an electric system from these guys? So how we both convey deep technical information, understanding, prove that we are a trustworthy company to deal with, and we're going to be around, and we're going to do all these things, and we know what we're talking about from engineering, from mechanical, electrical, all of these things, but then are also aspirational and cool at the same time. It's kind of a tricky thing to do, and it's kind of a tricky thing to do from a kind of a standing start and to just jump into this. I think it had to be very excited that it's also playful. So you see in the colour palette that we do have a black and a subtle grey blue and a black and white, right, that we can use. But then it jumps into colours as well. And I think that, you know, we are still a small business, and we'll be a small business for a long time, whatever that definition is, whether we're 50 people in Melbourne manufacturing and 100 people in Bristol, it's still a relatively small business, and we want to communicate that personality and that passion. I think that it's really easy to be building technical componentry and lose personality, and that B2B marketing doesn't have to lose that, because it's still, we know, and Chris and I both have a social media presence, whether that's YouTube or TikTok or Instagram. People are aware of us because we talk about the product and why we do it and what goes into it. That is what people are buying. They're buying the people, maybe we're not, neither Chris or I, and Chris is the CEO of Fellten globally, but the founder of Zero EV. Neither he or I are engineers, trained engineers. We have engineers working for us, with us, but we are able to, our job is really to communicate that. And so that if we can, and we do that we try and humanise that, we try and add, you know, humour just naturally to that, but make it enjoyable and playful. And so how do we signify that every decision that we've made, every part that we've made for one actually has a decision behind it? It's not just because it was there. We've chosen that, but we've chosen that to do something, and that ultimately that is to make a joyful experience. And what that means is then we've made it so that it is the most reliable part that we can find. That makes it joyful because every day you want to get into it and turn the key, it starts. So how do you can't say that stuff out loud, it's weird, but if you can present it through all these little touch points over and over again, that this represents us as a company and attracts the right staff, right? We're growing businesses, we need to, you know, we're competing for electrical engineers with, I don't know, Bosch or all these global companies, particularly in the UK where there's still a huge automotive industry. We're competing against these things for talent as well. So how do we be a nice place to work? We need to communicate that through brand.
Yeah. Kind of makes me start to think about, you know, electric vehicles in general and the market, and obviously what Fellten is doing is quite, you know, it's the circular economy. You're converting, there's billions and millions of cars already on the road that are conventionally powered, and really what you're doing is reducing waste by converting existing vehicles. I'd love to hear what you think about, you know, why someone's going to come to you or come to Fellten or choose to convert a classic car or a fleet of vehicles or a luxury car rather than going out and buying a Polestar or one of the other, you know, as we see all the legislative changes, people are, you know, more able to buy an electric vehicle. Yeah. And obviously it's not a this or that question, but what you're doing feels a lot more sustainable and a lot more considered and less impactful than buying new. So I'd love to hear your point of view on that as a business strategy, I guess.
I think for us, you know, the idea that we're upcycling vehicles is huge, and it's part of our, you know, we'll be a B Corp one day, and this will all be, you know, all this data will be part of it. But it's, you know, 80 to 90% of the embedded carbon is saved by us making these EVs. So the best thing you can do is obviously recycle stuff, whether that's cars or your house or whatever. So there's a huge part of that this is a converted vehicle is the greenest vehicle that you can put on the road. But we know that pure logic and reason and data around environmental factors doesn't necessarily move products. They have to be better at the same time. So we need to also be building cars that are at least comparable to a new vehicle. There's a lot of compromises in an old car. We can't get around that, whether that's safety, ergonomics. Like in an old Land Rover, like I don't fit, like my shoulder hits the window. I still love them all the same, but it's, there's compromises. But what we can do then is build vehicles that are the equal or better in some cases than what's available new, or has customizations that are just not available in a new vehicle. So there is two extremes. It's not cheap to do. Labour is expensive. Parts are expensive. There is an option to, if you like anything, if you're able to DIY it and salvage parts from a wrecked new electric vehicle, you can do this stuff. You can build conversions quite economically. At a commercial scale, it is more expensive. You expect more. There's labour. There's all these things. But where we end up being price comparable is if you look at a higher end four-wheel drive, of which, a true, and I mean four-wheel drive, when I say that, I mean true off-roading four-wheel drives, not like SUVs kind of thing. You can't really buy one in Australia. You can't buy a pure electric one. And even we had a customer say to us, we all thought the Cybertruck was going to be here now or already, right? But maybe it'll never come to Australia. But they were like, even when it does, who am I to get out of a Cybertruck? Who's that guy, right? What am I wearing? Like, it's such a different, and it is a stylistic consideration. I keep referencing the Mini because it's a beautiful object, right? And we're all buying clothes. We're not buying clothes on pure reason. There is sometimes you're wearing things that are a bit more uncomfortable because it's cool. And that's okay, and that's what cars fall into too. There's a lot of emotional reasons why you're choosing a brand, why you're choosing a shape and a colour. So we can open that world to create these, that you can have any vehicle you want and have all these other benefits. It's fast, it's reliable, all of these things. Then we have on the other side that, and I think for an individual owner, it's hard to justify, I've been, Ross is here, and I've talked to Ross is running some amazing projects around, totally transforming Australian cities, and we're a little part of that in some ways. But one of the questions that comes up then is, let's electrify every car in Australia. What does that do? And is that feasible? And the short answer is not really, and not without massive government assistance, because presented with the new Volkswagen ID3, ID4, which is essentially like an electric Golf, how do you convince someone with a 5 to 10 year old Golf to spend 40, 50 grand electrifying it when the new Golf that is electric is 50 or 60 grand? It's got the bigger CarPlay screen, it's got the extra airbag, it's got the this, it's got the that, and it's got a huge marketing campaign behind it. You can't, right? It's not going, for most people, that's not going to be the viable option. But at a higher end, it works. And then at the other end, when we're talking about fleet and commercial stuff, you can actually start to do ROI calculations. And so if we're looking at commercial vehicles, and it might be a Hi-Ace that's used for passenger transport, and it's burning $30,000 of diesel every year, and it's an 8-year service life, the servicing costs are less than half, maybe a third in terms of labour and parts. But then very quickly, maybe after 4 years, the electrification of that vehicle pays for itself.
Makes a lot of sense.
So that could be something like an ambulance, which has a $200,000 or $300,000 fit out of a vehicle. It's a lot cheaper, even though it might be an expensive electrification process for all the complexity. It's way cheaper than fitting out a new electric ambulance. So there is the vehicles that you want to keep forever anyway. I think that those, and by that broadly speaking, classics, and I don't mean that in a, there's car industry definitions of classics are pre this year or whatever. I just mean it as, cars that people are going to want to keep forever. There's modern classics, right? Yeah. And we might see that in, mid 80s vans that people are using to van life or whatever, right? Those are very desirable now, the right shape, right? So there's these vehicles that I think we can extend the life of dramatically. And we're talking about, 10 years easy, but depending on what you're driving, these batteries, these tech, low maintenance, have huge lifespan, hundreds of thousands of kilometres of lifespan with virtually no maintenance. So it extends this life enormously. And I think that, hopefully we start to see a little bit of a movement around.
Well, I feel like even in the past 2 or 3 weeks since I started writing my speaker's notes, I had to completely rewrite them because we've seen, happily a lot of movement from a legislative perspective. The Labor government making good on some of their election promises, particularly around the EV industry. I guess, it's really sad that as a nation we're very behind, and there's lots of reasons for that I won't kind of go into in depth, but a lot of it is government and infrastructure related, as well as, Australian land mass and scale. So for you, what are the kind of 3 big things that we need to see happen over the next 6 to 12 months that will actually make sure that we start to catch up to Europe and Japan in our penetration of electric vehicles? Quite a big question, sorry.
That's a big question.
That's a
3
curly
things.
one.
Oh my God! All right,
I told you I'd
change
grill
Australia
you.
in 3 questions.
Yeah, come on.
So, well, I think that Australia is an interesting place in terms of tech adoption, of anything adoption, and Australia and Australians index weirdly on cultural sort of psychological models. We're very independent and we're very much individual, but we're also very afraid of change. And there's a global model that people go through all of this stuff, and so we have this weird independence. And the way I've always done it is right, and therefore the new way is wrong, until it's not. And we see that on a adoption of DVD players or electric cars is very, very slow, and then it's very, very fast. The guy down the road gets one, and suddenly you realise that it ticks all these extra boxes. Maybe it can't do 1,200, 2,000 kilometres of range, but in every other way it's a better car. So I think we're going to start getting to this tipping point. We've seen local councils, state governments do so much work, as much work as they can, putting in charging points and all these things. I think the big thing is just going to be that it's talked about, even just talked about at a federal level. So there's policy is one thing, setting carbon emissions targets is a big one. So Australia has this sort of outdated, archaic laws around vehicles that protect the car industry that we don't have.
Yes.
And that includes things that have actually enabled our business to exist, which is no, and I would speak from a very Victorian context here, but we don't have a yearly roadworthy check. We have no emissions checks. These are broadly the same around Australia versus other countries where it's almost, they're moving old cars off the road to get newer, safer, less polluting cars on the road. Not having those things means we have a lot of old cars going around, which is great for conversion, but not so great in terms of pollution. We are the biggest polluters per capita per kilometre of driving of anyone in the world. We have the worst transport emissions of anyone. It's not just about we have distances, it is per kilometre. So that's because we have a lot of old cars and we have no one checking that the emissions are what the emissions were when you drove that car off the lot 5 years ago. So a few things like that, like regular emissions requirements, so both on a total cap of emissions for new cars. So like they do in the United States, where it's like, okay, Ford, your entire, you divide your number of vehicles sold by amount of emissions, it has to be under X. So that means that you've got to be making EVs to justify the fact that you're making very polluting trucks at this other end. We don't have anything like that. There's a bunch of simple legislation that can come in at a federal level that brings us in line with where the rest of the world was 10, 15 years ago. And suddenly, all these things that have come in, like little incentives, you get $3,000 back or $4,000, depending on states, it's different. But that push from government or legislation from government, which is very simple on their part in one way, gives it sort of changes that almost chicken and egg dynamic where global automakers are like, why bother with Australia? We have no reason to. We've got to, it's not just bringing the car in, people might want it, but we've got to bring the car in, we've got to train all our service staff, we've got to train dealers, we've got to do all this stuff. And there's no incentive when we've got a pent-up demand in the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Why not just keep shipping it there and give Australia the leftover diesel and petrol cars that no one else is wanting? So the only way to do that is to force manufacturers to do that. And I think that that's going to be the biggest thing. And when I say talk about it, those kinds of things, talking about it in that way, like I was saying, look up where charge points are. Electric vehicle chargers don't have giant neon signs. They are hidden. There's probably one in this block. I don't know, I should have looked it up before the event. But they're everywhere, as well as there being PowerPoints everywhere, right? It's that habitual change, and I think we'll see that snowball effect happen. And you probably think about how many more Teslas you're seeing on the road. Like Model Y is like third best-selling car in Australia each month for the last few months, or in the top 10 at least, which is outrageous for an electric vehicle to be there. There's this pent-up demand, and we're seeing it. And now that people are experiencing that habitual change, having that conversation with someone that, no, getting up in the morning and unplugging my car that then has a full battery is way easier than, to me, it's that change between going, oh, my tank's running low, my petrol's running low, I can't be bothered to go to the petrol station now. I'll just go in the morning. It'll be fine. I'll go in the morning. Then you get up in the morning and you forgot you were going to do that, and then you're 15 minutes late. All that goes away.
It's gone.
Right? There is a change in habit. And yes, sometimes if you're driving, you might, on a road trip, you've got to stop for 15 minutes longer because it's half an hour to fill up your battery versus 15 minutes to, pay for fuel and go in and do all that. But the benefits outweigh those things. And I think that Australia just has that. It's that everyone talking about it. That's what ticks it over. So we need that government policy. This is only 2 answers. I think that's enough. Federal government pushing that way, but also just people like us talking about it.
Well, off the back of your swathe of press when you released the new brand, I feel like a lot more people are talking about it. I'd love to finish off before we move into question time, thinking about, I guess, what's next. You guys have kind of done the merger. It's very exciting. The brand is out in the world. So what are the big kind of next steps for Fellten as a brand and as a business?
So now we've got to do all the work, right?
Yeah.
We've got to build all these things. So we've got to do 2 things. One of them is actually, announcing that we're Fellten is one thing, but underneath we're still 2 different companies on other sides of the world. All our engineering wikis, all our software integration, there's all this work that's in front of us for the next month or so. But then it's about expansion for us. It's about going from a little workshop, our workshop in Melbourne, just a little bit bigger than this maybe, to a facility that has a prototyping area about this big, but a manufacturing facility as well. So that we can start to be producing bolt-in systems at scale that we'll be distributing around the country and around Asia Pacific, and the same in the UK, expanding their facilities and going from sort of, 30, 40 systems globally to a couple of 100 systems globally, and then expanding on that. The demand is, so these aren't huge numbers in a car industry, right? That's what a big car company is putting out, 5 minutes after the first person walks in the door. But it's significant in that, like I said at the beginning, the impact and the awareness that we get out of those few hundred vehicles outweighs the few thousand, not to discredit Tesla, but other white and grey and fairly boring generic kind of SUV-shaped modern vehicles. So for us, it's actually solidifying that. It's using all this brand toolkit because we see it as a big thing. Of course, we've got to put little logos on every part that we make, every circuit board, every mechanical part where, there's a lot of that work to do. But there's also the technical support side of it as well. So there's marketing collateral and brochures and technical information. But for us, it's always been about how do we produce the parts and ultimately the cars that we want, which means that every car that we put out, every system that we put out, there's a QR code on it. You scan that QR code, you get full support documentation. Every wiring diagram, every technical drawing, it's all there, and it's all being communicated with this brand idea. So, and to me that's important because we can keep layering the idea that Fellten cares, right? We actually care about the product, we care about what you're doing with it, and we care that it's going to be there for a long term. And all of those that layering of effort and from the install instructions through to the support documentation just show that, this is a product that we want to last and want to work. So is that enough? That's a lot of description of the work, right? We've got to also do all the electrical and mechanical engineering, but scaling up is our next step, and putting this into practice and trying to be a little company that is perhaps doing more for our customers than a lot of big companies are doing in terms of their automotive parts and service and documentation.
Well, it's hugely exciting. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and sort of share your story and the journey that you've been on, pun not intended. But I'd love to gather a few questions if anyone has them for Dave. Any burning... Oh, there's a lot. You first, sir?
First off, really exciting. So really love to hear the vision of what you're setting out with. and hopefully a lot of success along the way. You brought up a really interesting point of the dynamics or the engagement with federal. Do you see Fellten having a role in that?
Yeah. So we're part of the Electric Mobility Manufacturers Association. So it's a new industry body, EMMA, new industry body, which is us. And if you're familiar, there's a few other great companies in Australia doing cool stuff. Savic Motorcycles, Fons Motorcycles in Sydney, Janus Electric Trucks, hot swappable big semi-trailer trucks, C Electric in Melbourne. So there is an electric vehicle manufacturing industry in Australia. It's small, but we have a little voice. So we're part of that and talking to government in that sense. And really, from a conversions point of view, most people have no idea that you can put a different engine of any kind in a car. So there's that conversation to have. The other big one is training. So the guys in the UK have developed a training program from sort of online courses through to City and Guild accreditation, which is equivalent to a sort of Cert 3, Cert 4 in Australia. We're Australianising that training system, and that's different because the big manufacturers have training here, but it's like plug in our branded computer, read the code, the error code, then order the part, not what's actually going on inside the system. So that deeper level of system integration and building is something that no one's offering because we don't have a manufacturing industry. So we're working with federal government as well on how we can make that a national training program. For us, the more people who know what's inside, like I think we don't want to, in the I guess, the spirit of everything we're doing, we don't want to be like, oh, you've got one little cell that's failed, therefore the whole battery pack's got to be gone and swap that, and it's huge expense. It's no, let's give people the tools and the education to be able to swap that one little piece that's failed. So that's kind of what we're working to. EMMA is a good, strong organisation with everyone's got a lot of energy at the moment to, no pun intended, so many automotive and electricity puns, to kind of push this and just get that awareness, right? Yeah.
Cool. Tom, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could briefly talk about what a conversion looks like and what are the core products that Fellten.
Yeah. So I'll use a lot of hand gestures to indicate this. Basically, you open the bonnet of your car, and there's if it's a modern car, there's a lot of black plastic, right? But under that is a lot of stuff. Obviously the engine, there's braking systems, aircon, heating, all of these different pumps and whatever. In a broad sense, all of that goes. And all of that goes because while we might need to, you still need brakes and heating and aircon, it doesn't work off the internal combustion engine anymore. It's all electric. So with a conversion, we are usually, the biggest challenge is finding space. So modern EVs, they'll do if you've ever seen, they'll call it a skateboard platform. So all the batteries low, motor at either end if it's got a dual motors, and then there's just a shell of a car on top. We don't have that luxury because we've got the shape of a car that was built for something completely different. But usually there's an engine bay that's a great location. And the biggest objects we're putting in are batteries. So if we think of the Land Rovers that we're doing, the front battery box is like this big. So we need all that space. The motor is maybe this big. So often it's, and lots of differences between different models, but often it's the motor going kind of where the gearbox was. So if you imagine an electric motor sitting in that transmission tunnel, the whole under the bonnet filled with batteries, and then electric versions of brake pumps and aircon and whatever. And then depending on what we're doing with range, then it might be a second or a third battery pack somewhere else, maybe where the fuel tank was, maybe under the sides of the car. You've got a bit of flexibility where you place that. Some of the components look cool and mysterious and have lots of ins and outs, and they're shiny. Most of what we're putting in is black boxes filled with batteries. Yeah.
And that's like case by case, you need to sort that out.
To a point. What we're doing at the moment, and that's been one of the big barriers for cost, because it's so much effort for each car. So for the Mini system that we do now, so in the UK, the guys worked with BMW, who owns Mini, to build an official conversion system. With with the right work, that is now a system that can be installed in about 6 hours into the vehicle. So a full sub-assembly, all the suspension, all the engine mount, one thing that you bolt into the front, a battery pack and a charger that you bolt into the rear, and new gauges. When we deal with vehicles like Land Rovers, we're designing a Land Rover specific thing, but around what we'd call a universal battery pack. So most cars, most of the time, they've kind of got this much space under the bonnet, right? And so a Land Rover is actually quite small. We build a battery pack that we know that can then work in Land Rovers, Land Cruisers, Monaros, Mustangs. That core amount of, you're trying to get about 350 volts and 55 kilowatt hours of energy is what we've got in that. That system then means we can go, this is most of the work done in terms of fitting something in. Then choose a motor, choose other things. So we can build off that platform and start using that. And the big thing for us is how do we get scale, right? How do we go from 10 to 100 to 1,000 units a year? And that has a real dramatic effect on cost.
Cool. Any more questions? Hi.
On behalf of your mum and all the mums out there, like Sydney, there's a huge demand for it. Just the supply, and they can't drive down to Williamstown to get the car service. So it feels like there needs to be Fellten up here.
Yeah.
As a Land Rover owner myself, I moved away from conventional cars just because the cost of servicing was just driving me mad. And it wasn't as a matter of principle; they were just too expensive. So with your mum in mind, it just feels like it's hard enough to find a combustible engine mechanic these days. It's really exciting to think that you could retool electricians, or like what is the typical profile of someone who can service a Fellten car look like? And your Sydney expansion plans, would love to hear about that.
Yeah, so I've been meeting with some people here in Sydney today. We're really keen to work with workshops who already know the car, right? So there's one thing, we've been building in Melbourne, particular Land Rover models. There might be a few thousand parts in the EV conversion system. There's a few more thousand parts in a car. And so there's already workshops who specialise in various models in terms of, painting it, redoing the interior, doing all these other mechanical upgrades. We want to be able to supply them with a bolt-in EV conversion system. So that's the way to expand and get them all over the country. But in terms of servicing, it's a big question. And we've been chatting with people like My Car, people like Bapcor who own Bursons and a few other big places. It's a really interesting transition for them because they're either running service workshops and concerned that everyone's moving to electric cars that need much less servicing, dramatically less servicing, and then on that dramatically less parts, so that you mark up on parts and whatever. And then if you're selling automotive parts, the whole industry that supplies automotive parts to those workshops is like, well, if people aren't burning through these consumable items, what are we doing? They are very, very keen to, there is still absolutely a role to play. And what we're not seeing yet is quite that coming to fruition because all the electric cars are so new. So they're not having these major wear items. They're not in a second and third owner yet. When they do get there, there's going to be a market. So all these companies, we're chatting with them. I know other EV makers are chatting with these people too around how we can transition their staff, train their staff, because what we'd love, our dream would be, and I'll use My Car just as an example. So that's the old Kmart Tire and Auto. They got bought out by Continental, right? It's an independent workshop brand. There's like 300 stores around the country. So there's a few of those change, Bow Repairs, whatever it might be. That if we can be like, okay, we've got all the same level of technical documentation as an OEM does, that you can be wherever you are in the country and know that you can drive into one of these places, then that kind of makes, it's that peace of mind of it's still an expensive vehicle and you can get that done. I think the challenge is that the challenge almost of a communication point of view is that the EV side requires very, very little. The car side requires the same amount that the car side used to. So if we're dealing with classics, they still have the problems of the classics in a lot of ways. We can improve a lot of pieces, but you've still also got to have someone who understands the old cars in a weird way. This isn't a great answer because it's a challenging question, right? We're not proposing though that we're creating mass market vehicles for most Australians, right? I think that, but what we can do is even if we're getting the My Cars, again, to use them as an example, excited about EVs, and we can have their technicians working with us to understand in depth what's going on in an EV, they're then better able to do the more general servicing of a mass market OEM vehicle. Yeah.
In democratising the EVs and upgrading classics, it almost feels like as an ancillary business, you want to democratise charging stations. And so instead of the hay planes driving from Wagga to Hay, it's a long distance. But if you're able to say to farmers, like, hey, here's a kit you can put on your farm, it'll charge itself, and you have it there, they earn some income from it or something. That's like
so, I mean, that's why I'm really excited about electric vehicles, right? As opposed to, say, hydrogen fuel cells, which have incredible technical merits, but maintain that, it's refined, it's distributed, it's sold, it's here, there's this control of it, that it democratizes energy in so many ways. So one really interesting hack you can do right now is almost every showgrounds in every country town, there's a 3-phase outlet somewhere there. Go and plug in. No one's checking. And same with if you drive around an industrial estate, there's definitely a 3-phase power outlet somewhere. So there is that, but I think that, when you go through a little town and you're like, oh, look at that, it was a cute old service station. They used to sell petrol and they haven't for 50 years. It's about, for $2,000 you can put an EV charger on the wall. And for a little bit more, you can put a payment terminal on it. And so that it's not just farmers, it's every little, and you see it now with, Tesla really did some really smart work of going destination charges, right? There's nothing special about that product. They'll charge any EV on the market. But it was the idea that restaurants and cafes and tourism destinations would do that was really smart. And I think we'll see more and more of that, right? The big challenge is that you can, without getting into the technical details of charge rates, you can charge up to maybe 20 kilowatts, let's say at a max, off 3-phase industrial power. To go to DC fast charge, which is like, hey, charge a car in 15 minutes kind of thing, that requires massive infrastructure on behalf of the energy companies to put in place. So there's a big educational challenge of understanding that just because your car can charge at a certain rate, what you're plugging into maybe can't deliver that. But yes, I've plugged into many weird and wonderful power outlets. And yeah, that's the thing. It's like it's somewhat of a, if anyone knows Glengarry Glen Ross reference, but ABC is actually always be charging, which is the electric vehicle motto.
Dave's got it tattooed on him. Any more questions before we... Oh, there's 100. Man in the back.
Just realise the dynamics of the car. So you often you buy a classic car, say or something, it's going to have handling and performance in an old sense of word, nothing like the modern. But do you sort of approach a kind of, do you have a performance hat on when you're, where does the battery go? How is it going to work in a car that wasn't designed to have a battery at the front and the back? And do you find that sometimes it's better or worse, or is there sort of real change in that? How do you sort of, is that a thought process when you're doing that with a car like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So old cars, the ones that have made it to become classics are either beautiful to look at. Sometimes they're beautiful and they're terrible to drive, but sometimes they're incredible, right? And sometimes that's the charm. Sometimes they're incredible to drive, or they have a real character. If you've seen it, that's Vince's old Porsche out the front there, right? That's not a fast car. I mean, you haven't done anything crazy under the hood, no. But it's a wonderful feel of a car. And how do you describe that? How do you put that in a spreadsheet and go, we've got to capture this thing and this? But yes, it is about, so what makes a car feel that way? Well, it's about where the weight is in the car. It's about how the steering is connected. It's about what it feels like when you put your foot down, how fast that power is. What's it feel like in each gear? There is a lot of elements to do with that. And so we've been, we've really started it going, we didn't want to be neither Zero or us, so Fellten collectively ever wanted to be hey, bring in any car in and we'll convert it. For us, it was about developing a system that is what they would have made if they could have made an electric car back in the day. And so it's about us driving and understanding what makes that car to us. I mean, it's so subjective, right? And it's so hard to describe. But once we understand that car, then we can tune it in a way. And that's the beauty is yes, there's a weight distribution question, there's a mechanical question, but a lot of it becomes a software question. You can tune an electric motor to such a fine detail that you can get that feeling right. When you're using electric power steering, which we often do, because often we have to put collapsible sections in steering columns, and all these other little things that go into it. We do upgrade the brakes, we upgrade all these other elements. If you just make the throttle pedal feel amazing, the rest of the car feels terrible in comparison. So you've got to bring all of that up, but you want to keep the feel. And so it's been interesting to have old Land Rover collectors. They're not old, they're collecting old Land Rovers. And have driven them for years, driven so many, and get in and go, oh, I thought it would be different. Like I thought it would be a new car that felt totally different, but it still feels like a car. So some of that's our work, I think, and we've got some really smart engineers and people who've done, tunes and calibrations for global OEMs. But I think some of it's just the natural limitations of an old car. You're still dealing with the same mechanical pieces, the wheels are still in the same spot. It's still something magic about that space or the ergonomics or lack of. To us though, it's not about building hot rods. It's not about just going crazy power. It's about building a whole car, which means that not every car needs to be a 0 to 100 monster. Yeah.
Makes sense. All right. Tone?
I think it's fantastic what you're doing, because you're going to be helping what you might call a below-the-line industry that I'm aware of, which is there are literally thousands of what I usually call rev heads or hot rod heads that are incredibly highly skilled, and they're weaning themselves off ICE engines at the moment, because the moment they try something that's electric, it kind of makes the Datsun 1600 really go. Yeah. And there's a huge it's a kind of organisation is too big a word for it. It's a kind of subterranean grouping. You've got Emma, we've got AEVA, which is the Australian Electric Vehicle Association. Basically, it's old guys in cardigans and long socks.
I've been to the meetings,
So, but they have enormous knowledge. I mean, one of them, for instance, has converted a Citroen DS, which is a pneumatically powered, and built his own batteries, because you can get a set of batteries to go in it. So I think you're tapping into something in Australia and New Zealand. I mentioned Kiwi, because they're much more advanced in it. Yeah. I buy my Nissan Leaf engines, which now, of course, everyone knows, but you can buy second-hand Nissan Leafs from at least the componentry from New Zealand, because they've had so many of them, and they're not very good drivers, and they crash them. So you get a lot of them. But I think what you were talking about in terms of making componentry that will go out into the market, that people are going to take that and adapt it in ways that you probably...
And that's what we're really excited about. So I didn't really talk about it here, but it's like we distribute, warehouse and distribute components. So from fuses to relays to batteries to all these things that help exactly those people you're talking about. And to be able to do things, to be able to buy in quantities where we can talk to global OEMs and get OEM quality parts that you just can't buy in Australia. So it's really challenging in Australia at the moment, because a company might exist in Australia, if you might have heard of them, like Amphenol, TE, these are big global manufacturers of electronic components. They, in their catalogue, have all this EV stuff. You can't buy any of it in Australia. So we'll be bringing a bunch of stuff in to help workshops like that. And I see that there'll be this transition where, I think that the stats are like, there's more people working in small corner garage workshops than there are in the coal industry in Australia, right? It's a nice little stat, but there's this huge pool of car enthusiasts. Of course there is. We know that Australians are in love with these cars, but you're mashing this together with technology enthusiasts as well. And it creates a different dynamic. We're running an education program along with one of the tech schools in Victoria with doing a girls in STEM program. So this is kind of 15, 16-year-old students who are restoring an old classic Range Rover, electrifying that along with us. Those students have all admitted that they would never be doing this if it was a mechanical engine. they care about old cars because they're cool, but they don't want to work on internal combustion engines. They're doing this because they see careers in robotics or drones or any kind of electric mobility, scooters. This is all the same tech. So this is a pathway to a lot of different things, and it brings in people with whole different, from a sort of technology mindset, not just a rev head mindset.
Well, the best Land Rover is probably the electric four-wheel drive Rover on Mars, which is why I think the electronics component of it is so fascinating, that we've moved from a mechanical era into an electronic era, but two things have never moved. The house hasn't moved and the car hasn't moved. And what's really interesting is that you're now going to have retro-styled houses that have complete electronic componentry in them, and you're going to be able to buy wiring looms for 1974 broad-nosed minis. What I think is really interesting that you're doing, though, is you're concentrating in one particular area to make it go everywhere. And I think what that does is it means that you perfect something so that you're not doing what other people have done overseas and try and be everything to everybody.
Yeah, quality is what we always had to start with. We were like, we have to build a quality system. We refer to OEM quality, but we mean that as like that. What you expect from a mass manufactured product now is really perfection and reliability, right, and precision. So that's where we had to start. We can work on scale. We can work on affordability, to be honest, after we get that right. And so, yeah, if we can.
Cool. Last question, and then we'll... Oh.
All go together.
All go together.
Is that me?
Yeah, it's you. Sorry.
Have you got, are you seeing in the future, or even now, any sort of like components arm race, particularly around batteries, in the sense that a lot of these conversions are using second-hand batteries. So in a sense, is there a competitiveness in that market, but then also from the OEMs dominating the new component sector as well? Is that going to be a challenge either now or in the future?
No. And I say that because, so the news every week, new electric vehicle battery can charge in 5 minutes, it can do this, it can do that. Yes, those are scientific developments that are every week. Those are 10 years away at a minimum from any kind of commercialisation. The rate of battery density, ability to deliver energy, charge cycles, all of the things that that make a battery better is on us. Well, whether you want to do it up and to the right or down or whatever you're measuring, it's a slow, steady march towards that. It's not something that, oh my God, I bought an electric car in 2022 and if only I'd waited 1 year, it would have been an explosive difference. Electric motors have been running, elevators for 100 years. It's still a 2-ton steel box moving humans. These things, there's developments in efficiencies and higher speeds and stuff, but they're relatively the same thing. We see that with batteries too. So that question around salvaging parts for conversions, there's definitely more and more of that. As individuals do it, it's a really great, when your time is free as a person doing it, it can make sense. For us as a business, the labour cost to do that work is difficult to justify, and it's difficult to then sell a product that really has no warranty or backup, and we can't truly tell. I mean, we can do all the tests and we can do all the things, but we can't be 100%. We don't have 100% backup on that. So the other thing is that now that we're dealing even at a little bit of scale, we can be ordering batteries direct from manufacturers. So all of our systems that we're putting into Land Rovers and that we're building around is a battery module about so big. That's the same battery module that Volkswagen use on all their electric vehicles and will be for a number of years. So that's we can get that cheaper than we can get salvaged batteries. And so we know that we can be building around a platform that is equal to manufacturers. And what we're seeing is as there's more and more EV parts manufacturers, there's more and more access to these things. And that if you'd asked me this question 2 years ago, I would have said, oh my God, yeah, we're about to just jump up. What we've seen in particularly the last couple of years, is products designed specifically for conversions in a way, or access to. So we make our own range of motors. We are able to talk to component manufacturers for batteries, but it's now trickled down that we can build that kind of level, and we'll just see that as a slow progression rather than any major jumps.
All right, I reckon we've got time for one more question. You had one earlier? Oh, there's so many, sorry.
I'm sure you've thought of this, but have you considered a top hat design strategy where you bolt in a classic body onto an existing flexible architecture?
Yeah, but it's unfortunately pretty illegal in Australia, and that's the challenge. So in the US in particular, where there's very few rules about putting a car on the road, very few, you can get, and depending on the state, you can get away with a lot. There's a great company called, one reason Zero had to change, there's a company in the US called Zero Labs, do some really cool stuff, which is brand new platform, classic body, scanned it, they make it out of composite and whatever, but it looks like an old car, old Bronco, old Land Rover. Amazing handling, performance. So it does two things. Well, the first one is that, to the guy's point before, it's absolutely not that car anymore. It's a cute body shell, but it's also got all those downsides of that old body shell. Like I say, like I don't fit in them and whatever. And it's still not the old car. There's something weird about that to me. But the other big one is that we just can't do it. There is little loopholes in Australia about individually constructed vehicles and things. But as soon as we were to make a new platform, that's a 2022 car. And a 2022 car has to have airbags, it has to have stability control, it has to have autonomous braking. An old car doesn't have that. So to retrofit and build all of that, we'd have to have a body shell that was full of airbags and did all these other things that would be very difficult to fit in. It kind of works in other markets, but I think that it kind of, what are you building in the end? There's a few places I could go into detail about that, but yeah.
A beautiful
Dave, I've got
go-kart.
one question. Are you worried about running out of Land Rover bodies?
No.
That's what concerned me.
No. So Australia was buying, the word is that Australia was buying half the Land Rovers made back in the 60s and 70s, right? That was the only four-wheel drive you could buy. There was, we didn't have American four-wheel drives yet. Every farmer, every government department. Then Toyota came in with a more reliable product with a better dealership network, and everyone put their Land Rovers in the shed and left them there. Aluminium bodies didn't rust, so they're all kind of still there, right?
Perfect. Got one last question in the back. Yeah, it's you.
Okay. I'm interested in the way in which you're communicating basically to the motor vehicle owners out there. How supportive have automotive bodies like the RACV or the NRMA been in getting on board around the overall messaging to motorists that this exists?
Well, not very, but not in that it's their fault. I think we've not made a lot of vehicles, we've not made a lot of noise. This is the point where we start going, this is serious and this is an industry, and it's not just a few workshops doing things. We've been to, say, VACC, we've been to RACV, and I've spoken to them, and it's like, oh, look at this cute thing, and everyone comes and looks at it, right? But it's hard for them they're busy talking about the broader industry. Those organisations have been instrumental in getting the charging networks where they are. They all banded together and bought ChargeFox. Like, I think this is where I'm excited about Australia going from very slow to very fast. We're the only country in the world with essentially a community-owned charging network, a mutual, whatever those, RMA, VSSC, they're, clubs that are for the benefit of members, not profits, are owning the biggest charging network in Australia. That is an amazing piece of infrastructure that we collectively own. So I think that they're doing these other big plays. We're hopeful that as we grow, they'll start to be champions of us being parts of lots of other little automotive workshops. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dave, for taking the time and flying up from Melbourne. It was really interesting to hear a million more things, and I'll put my name down on the waiting list for a conversion, because
Cool,
I hear it's
cool.
a couple of years long at this stage.
It is pretty long, but that's how, so it's into 2024, but that's because, it's partly we haven't scaled yet, right?
Yeah.
So it's like current capacity, it's out there. We'll start scaling early next year and distributing systems so that we can, I think of our 7 vehicles we're working on in the workshop, none of them are for Victorian customers.
Ooh.
Right, so the more that we can get other workshops around the country
The
doing
quicker
those installs,
Vince will get his
the
electric
quicker
Defender.
Vince will get his car converted.
I just want to thank you, David. Thank you, Natalie, as well. It's amazing. I haven't seen anybody fidget. Like, you've been watered, you've been fed, and you've been intently watching the gestures.
Awesome gestures.
But you guys it still continues. You guys are happy for you guys to hang out, have a few more drinks, have a few more chats. I know Dave's going to get to the airport by 9:30 probably. But thank you so much for coming. Let's give Dave a round of applause.